席静かに受け渡しが発車いたします。ドアにご注意ください。
3番線に電車が6両で入ります。ですから、ホームの内側にお座りください。この列車は折り返し。
お待たせいたしました。今日も JR 西日本もご利用くださいましてありがとうございます。西時快速の城塚方面の京橋駅です。止まりませんが、いいですのは、いつでもマットに東岸和田、泉内、本当に国川田、大師、天王寺、新宮、天天寺、西部上大阪です。途中稲乗りは14時30分、天王寺15時15分。大阪15時35分、終点京橋には15時43分に行きます。普通電車はこの後に。
You don't close your eyes, you usually drop them a little on the floor in front of you. Because the object is not to cut out all the things that you might be experiencing through your eyes and through your ears, through your nose and your nerve ends on the skin. The object is simply to let one's mind alone, to experience, but not to try to catch hold of one's experience in force. Simply to think. No, I wouldn't say think, that's a word we use very ambiguously. When I use the word think, I mean talk to yourself, or bring a lot of images before your mind which have nothing to do with what's right in front of you. So, the function of this exercise, this posture, is to let the whole world come to you without interfering with it in any way, just sitting like that. You may say, oh, that's a great waste of time. There are all sorts of interesting things in life to do. Why just spend some hours sitting? And the reason, though, as I tried to explain, is that it is through this that one comes to have a contact no longer with a world of abstractions, no longer with a world of thought, but with the world that actually is. Now, as you do this, you begin to notice a rather curious change in your general feeling of life. You notice that there ceases to be what I would call an interruption or an interval between your experience and yourself. You see, in our ordinary way of using our minds, the chronic sense of strain, the chronic attempt to think about and make sense of what we are feeling, is what we call our ego. If you say, I experience my own existence, I am aware constantly of a knower behind and receiving all that is known, then you get this chronic sensation of there being an I, a self, who has all these experiences, and that I or self is what we call the ego. And this chronic sense of strain is our, you might call it our psychological blocking against our experience. The thing that seems to divide us from an external world, from the whole universe. But when in this way the interval begins to diminish, we begin to experience our world as ourselves. There is no interval, there is no interruption between the knower and the known. Just as when we are completely absorbed listening to music or dancing to music, we are not aware of our separation from it. We go right with it. And so, in the same way, when the mind responds instantly to what the senses bring, it seems almost as if the mind and what it experiences were one and the same. Now, in a way, of course, this is actually true. We can understand this theoretically, but we don't ordinarily really feel it. For example, you know the old saying, if a tree falls in a forest with nobody listening to it, will there be any noise? Perhaps you know the limericks in which this problem is posed. There was a young man who said, God, I find it exceedingly odd that a tree, as a tree, simply ceases to be when there's no one around in the quad. And the answer was, young man, your astonishment's odd. I'm always around in the quad, so the tree, as a tree, never ceases to be since observed by yours faithfully, God. But this is a great philosophical puzzle for the Western world. Does what we know depend on there being a knower? Now, in a way, obviously, it does. Because when a tree falls in the forest, it certainly makes vibrations in the air. But those vibrations in the air do not become noise unless they vibrate an eardrum. So, in the same way, the light from the sun does not become light unless it falls on an eye, an eyeball. And two, we could say the external world is full of hard things. But nothing is hard except in relation to the soft surface of the human skin. Nothing is heavy except in relation to human muscles. So if there is not a human organism, the world does not appear to us at all as having any of the characteristics which we attach to an external world. In other words, we could say, the sun is light, but only because of eyes. Rocks are hard, but only because of soft fingers. Falling rocks are noisy, but only because of sensitive human ears. We cannot form any idea at all of what the world would be like without an observing mind. Even such things as duration, the span of time, depend upon the human mind to appreciate. Space depends on a human mind to observe the world from a particular position and so know that there are things which are distant from it. Without this mind, there could not be any world that we could think about or conceive or imagine in any way whatsoever. And so this shows in a very clear way that our mind and the external world go together. They are inseparable differences. You remember in a recent program how I tried to illustrate the idea of inseparable differences by taking a coin or an object here like a cigar, which has two distinct ends, but you cannot separate those ends. This is very important. It's worth repeating because it's quite fundamental. If I would want to take one of these ends off and break the thing and throw it away, it would still have another end. There would still be two ends there. I could never get rid of the situation of it having two ends. So you see that although the two ends are different, there is just one object. And so in the same way, although there is a difference, in a way, between the knower and the known, between man and the world, nevertheless, these two go together, and they are fundamentally inseparable. And therefore, when our consciousness is responding instantly, without any interval or interruption, without any, shall we say, stopping to think about it, then we have a situation in which we are actually realizing, we are actually feeling the true physical relationship which exists between man and his environment. And this we could call the experience of oneness or unity with the universe, which is the function of meditation. Now, I think it's not difficult to see some very obvious values in this. Because, well, if we live entirely in a world of thought, all the things that we pursue in life tend in a way to become arid and unsatisfactory, because we are living in an abstract world. In other words, nobody in his senses is going to eat a menu instead of dinner. Nobody in his senses is going to try and get a satisfactory diet of dollar bills. And yet, you see, dollar bills and menus stand in the same relation, on the one hand to wealth, on the other hand to dinner, the same relation in which thought stands to reality. They represent it, they symbolize reality, but they are in no sense substitutions for it. Yes, you can do a great deal of things if you have a lot of dollar bills, but unless you exchange those dollar bills into real concrete worth, they are of no value to you. And so in the same way, if we try to live in the world of pure thought, we begin to feel a strange, unsatisfactory quality to the world. And this living in pure thought is not something that is only done by, professors and intellectuals and thinking people. Perfectly ordinary people often live in the world of pure thought. As, for example, when we pursue certain goals in life, when we say, I want to be successful, I want to be happy, these are really abstractions. Because supposing you become enormously wealthy and you're able to afford 3 cars and 6 houses, you can't drive in 3 cars at once. You can't live in 6 houses at once. You have a symbol, which we call prestige, of your status, but that is an abstract symbol. You can't eat prestige. You can't eat success. And so, to overcome that kind of beguilement by the fantasies of thought, not thinking is an important adjunct to thought. To be able, every so often, to cease the hubbub going on inside one's head and to let talking to oneself stop and come to stillness. You needn't, of course, sit in the meditation posture like this to do it. This is simply the way it's done by Buddhists, Hindus. You can walk, you can sit in the ordinary way, you can lie in the bathtub and do it. You can lie on your back in bed before you get up in the morning and do it. Just let your mind alone and stop trying to make sense of the world, so that there is really something to think about other than thought itself. It's like if we wrote books about nothing but books. This is, I'm afraid, what a great deal of scholarship is. Books about books about books. So in this way, through meditation, we come to that kind of profound peace which is exhibited in the faces of the Buddhas. I remember particularly some words by Lafcadio Hearn, in which he gives a marvelous description of the whole attitude which these faces represent. Each eidolon shaped by human faith remains the shell of a truth eternally divine, and even the shell itself may hold a ghostly power. The soft serenity, the passionless tenderness of these Buddha faces might yet give peace of soul to a West weary of creeds transformed into conventions, eager for the coming of another teacher to proclaim, I have the same feeling for the high as for the low, for the moral as for the immoral, for the depraved as for the virtuous, for those holding sectarian views and false opinions, as for those whose beliefs are good and true.
as we came into a relationship with the mushroom, humanness emerged on the African veldt and was able to stabilize itself for a few millennia, and then we fell into history because of climatological change, for many reasons, but we literally fell into history, and now we operate in this lower domain, a domain of limitation, of misunderstanding, of low-grade languages, and we are neurotic, we are unhappy, we are dysfunctional, and I believe this is because our connection to the logos, to the informing voice that gives meaning to being, has been broken. Over 10,000 years, it's fallen away. And all we're left with is our spiritual yearnings, our nostalgia for paradise, and our pathologies. And miraculously, we are left with the time capsule of preservation represented by the rainforest shamanic cultures that use hallucinogens. There lies our answer, but it's like the Ouroboros serpent taking its tail in its mouth. The salvation of the super future of the planet lies in a recovery of the values, modalities, and religious practices of 25 to 50,000 years ago. I think that's because there was anciently, and over the evolutionary life of human beings, actually a connection between us and nature, and that these drugs are the antenna, the switches that switch us back toward the logos of the natural world. I suspect that all of nature is a seamless web of pheromonally mediated connections and interactions, and that we are just not yet at a sufficient level of analysis and sophisticated observation to see this interconnected web. You know, our idea of nature is that it's all tooth and claw, survival of the fittest, and the devil take the hindmost. The new version of evolution is entirely different. It says the way you attain survival is by making yourself indispensable to everybody else. So it's not by triumphing over the ecosystem, but by integrating yourself so thoroughly into it that it can't function without you. Then you're on your way to being a dominant species, not by crushing the opposition. Let's see how we're doing here. What are deconstructionists doing to our understanding of the language? Is it helpful? By deconstructionists, I suppose you mean Jacques Derrida and that crowd. Well, I think deconstruction serves a very useful function. I think we're unaware of how thoroughly language is the medium in which we swim, how thoroughly our world is built of language. In a way, the boundary-dissolving character of the plant hallucinogens is a dissolving of language barriers. They show you that the surface of reality was not the surface of reality, it was the surface of your local language. And now it's gone, and here is what lies beneath it. At what point in the evolution of organic matter on Earth do psychoactive plants appear, and why? Interesting question. If we're talking about psychoactive fungi, we're severely limited by the fossil record because no fossil mushroom has ever been found older than 40 million years. This is because fossil mushrooms are very soft-bodied, ephemeral kind of things. As primary decomposers, which is what fungi are doing on this earth, it's reasonable to assume that they must have been here from the very beginning of the conquest of the land. But proof in the fossil record has not been forthcoming. Now, if we're talking about higher plants, flowering plants, which is mostly what we're talking about here, then no flowering plants existed before 65 million years ago. Flowering plants emerged out of the same catastrophe that destroyed the dinosaurs and set the stage for the emergence of the mammals. This is something people don't realize. Flowering plants are as recent as mammals. You know, if you look at if the period of life on Earth is visualized as a yardstick, the period of the flowering plants is the last inch and a half. And it's also the rise of the mammals occurs in that last inch and a half. So before that, the plant life on the Earth was of a very different sort, and we know nothing about its chemistry. Here's someone who asked a Zen question. What would make the present government interested in the study of psychedelics? I don't know. If they could make a buck out of it? I don't think they're very interested in psychedelics. I don't think any political... What?
CIA, they were very interested in psychedelics.
Except that they abandoned it. Yes, MK-Ultra, for those of you who don't know, stands for mind control, spelled the Southern way. Mind Control Ultra was a program the CIA pursued in the 1960s where they tried out all kinds of psychedelic drugs, and they also worked with it in combination with hypnosis. They were trying to make what they called the Trojan horse. This was somebody who would be an assassin but not even know it. And how far they got with all of this, we will never know, because of course it all disappears behind the walls of secrecy. But the declassified history of the CIA and LSD is very interesting. Some of you may know the book Acid Dreams by Martin Lee. Fascinating history of the way the government tried and really failed, I think, to use psychedelics. The government's initial approach to LSD was, this is great. This is a truth serum. We can give this to enemy agents and they'll tell us all we know. Well, a few months of following that path, they decided, no, this is an obscurity drug. We can give this to our agents and they can take it if they're captured and no one can learn anything from it. And, you know, clearly this was not a fruitful path either. And I don't fault the government. I don't really fault the government for this. After all, the government is in the business of being the government. I don't think any institution can inculcate psychedelics into its own program, because psychedelics destroy institutions. All institutions. I mean, it's like trying to move an acid around that corrodes whatever pipes you pour it through. And because the boundary dissolving quality of psychedelics is precisely the quality that government is involved in resisting. Government builds up labels, hands out role models, explains how everything is, and this stuff just then melts that back into a primal chaos. So it's pretty corrosive of any social values that don't arise spontaneously out of biological organization. It's anarchist. It's the acid of anarchy in a way. That's what it's all about at the atomic level, is in your synaptic cleft, in the synaptic clefts of your neurons, there are what are called receptors. And if you were to fly down and look at these things, they look like complex locks. They're hooks, protuberances, little drawers, and fit in places. Well, then the drug molecule is carried into the synaptic cleft by the bloodstream, and it seeks to what's called occupy the bond site or simply bond. And it's trying to fit in. Well, the normal thing which fits in those bonding sites is serotonin. But some of these hallucinogens are much better fits than natural serotonin. They are what pharmacologists say competitive at the bond site. And so they literally elbow the serotonin out of the way, and then they fit themselves into the receptor. Well, once the receptor and its agonist are in place, then the biodynamic, the bioelectric field of the synapse can be activated. Well, if you swap out serotonin for an exotic molecule like harmine or mescaline or something like that, well, then this shifts the mode of this molecular level electrical environment. And I believe that that is what then registers as a higher cortical experience that we call the trip. It's the experience of hundreds of millions of these introduced molecules displacing the normal serotonin and then broadcasting this signal in a slightly different way than it is normally perceived. So there's a molecular connection. There's a connection down into the molecular level. This will be our last one this morning. Language transcendence. Huxley, Jung, and others often mention liberating and enlightening epiphanies as beyond language and iconic imagery. You yourself mention this. Can you explain further the use of transcendental language? Yeah, and we might talk about that a little this afternoon. I sort of alluded to it this morning. My idea is that language is a process that is half completed in us as we sit here, and that language is really something which wants to be seen, not heard, but that we are on our way to evolving toward this visible language. And we currently are operating with these somewhat substandard acoustical codes. And I think in a way history is the process of getting out, revealing, defining, refining this natural language. The place where the psychedelics' impact upon us as social creatures is the language domain. I mean, you may have tremendous hierophanies and breakthroughs, but if you can't talk about it, or paint about it, or dance about it, or in any way communicate it to anybody, then it is not efficacious for the species. It's just your private entertainment. So the domain of language is where the collective impact is coming. And one of the things I think about psychedelics is that they are probably capable of helping us force the evolution of language, because we cannot move into the future any faster than our language of description for the future. So if we're interested in streamlining culture and getting away from this sort of random walk style of cultural evolution, then we have to look at rationally interfacing with the evolution of language. And maybe we can talk about that when we come back. Thanks very much.